After the Holocaust, never again was the world's pledge to never again allow those atrocities to be committed here on this earth. Yet some 70 years later, a genocide is raving in China. In the Xinjiang province, the Uyghur people, an ethnic minority, face the genocide of their lifetime. China denies this, but who are the Uyghur people, and what do we know about the government of China that can shed light on this situation? Lisa Longo Johnston is a teacher at the Pingry School in New Jersey, an adjunct professor of history at Northampton Community College, and she'll be joining us to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. After the Holocaust, the world pledged never again to the atrocities that shocked us. And yet some 70 years later, human rights activists allege that in the Xinjiang province of China, in the northwest of the country, this very same atrocity is occurring to the Uyghur people, an ethnic minority in China. Of course, the government of China denies this, which leads to the question of who is China? What is the current government like there? And who are the Uyghur people? Joining us tonight is Lisa Longo Johnston. She teaches at the Pingry School in New Jersey and is adjunct professor of history at Northampton Community College, including teaching a course on modern China. Professor Johnston, welcome to Face the Issues. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam. It's great to be with you.
It's good to have you here. And Lisa, let me just start with an overarching question. China is one of the oldest civilizations on this planet. And so we certainly, one show is not going to be enough to talk about Chinese history in its totality. But in just the last 100 years or so, they've gone from the dynastic era to a republic to the current communist regime that we know of. Can you give us a timeline that will help us understand who China is today?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, China has this incredibly rich, lengthy history going back at least 3,500 years in written history. So their story is certainly long and complex. But I would say that there are several consistencies that extend across that time period that might be helpful for people to understand. And I think maybe we could start with geography as a foundation. China obviously covers a vast geographic region with people from a diversity of ethnic, linguistic, and cultural backgrounds, people who live thousands of miles apart from one another. So the focus for a very long time, going back to the dynastic period and extending into today, has long been on constructing a unified Chinese identity, promoting a sense of solidarity, and reinforcing allegiance, whether to the dynasty in power, to the republic for a brief period of time, and now to the Chinese Communist Party. So there's always been this consistent focus on bringing disparate parts of the country together, whether it was the civil service exam, this standardized test that government officials had to take, which China used for about 1,200 years, which standardized the process of selecting government officials and ensuring that those who then went out to govern in the provinces had a consistent idea of what it meant to be a Chinese official, or if it was Mao's Cultural Revolution, which imposed across China a very specific toxic ideology. So while we're talking about different time periods, they're all very different, but they all of these governments really did aim to unite the country, sometimes to the great detriment of the people, and overcome some of the challenges imposed by geography. In terms of a timeline, very briefly, China had a dynastic system up until the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. So the dynastic system extended into the 20th century. This was a game changer. So China declared itself a republic in 1911, and it was a pretty tumultuous period, and much of what happened wasn't necessarily very Republican. And this opened the door for a lot of conversations about what it meant to be Chinese, what it meant to what it meant to be modern. And so those conversations were all taking place against the backdrop of world wars, and ultimately, in part with the help of the Soviet Union, ultimately the Chinese Communist Party emerged. There was a civil war, and by 1949, the Communist Party of China took control of the government and then essentially became the government. There has been this one-party system in China ever since.
Lisa, you brought up the one-party system since 1949. You talked about Mao's Cultural Revolution. I think a lot of our viewers aren't always familiar with how life is different in a communist regime like China versus here today. Can you outline some of those differences? What are the things that we might enjoy today in America that our friends in China would not have the freedom to do?
Right, absolutely. So for starters, China is absolutely an authoritarian regime. China is currently spending more money on internal surveillance than it does on national security. There are parts of China where there are literally surveillance cameras every 6 feet. And so the state has an awful lot of eyes on the people. The goal of the CCP in large part is to, again, promote this conformity. I think the social credit system that has emerged there is a good indicator of that. The social credit system emerged in 2014. It is not completely centralized yet. A lot of the social credit system happens at the local levels. Some of it is being run by Chinese corporations. But the basic idea is that everything you do earns you a score. So everything from how much money you have, how you spend that money, how much time you have playing video games, where do you donate to charity, are you a good driver, what do you post on social media? All of these things earn you a score that is generated by a combination of the banks, the courts, and government officials. And then ultimately, there are either punishments or incentives. So it could range from, your punishments could range from having slower internet access to not being able to purchase property. So that is life for people on a regular basis. The Chinese Communist Party is firmly in control. Xi Jinping has been the leader of China since 2012, and it looks like he will be there in perpetuity. He has consistently amassed more and more power, both politically and socially. So politically, Xi Jinping thought his philosophy of governance and what he believes China is and should be moving forward has been enshrined in China's constitution, and is also taught in schools throughout China. So he is up there at this point with Mao Zedong in terms of prominence. As a result of all of this, life exists without the essential freedoms that we enjoy in the United States. And if you happen to be a member of one of China's ethnic minority groups, especially a couple of key ethnic minority groups, then life is even more challenging.
Lisa, let me ask you this. You talked about Xi Jinping, the current president, and some people would say, well, why don't they just vote him out? It's really not that simple in China, though. And there's no real path to vote him out, short of the party as a whole removing him. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely, it is. Absolutely. Back in the 1990s, China had imposed presidential term limits, and those have since been eliminated. So if he wants to, the path is really very wide open for Xi Jinping to remain in power in perpetuity. So it's not really about what the people want. The party is the state, and so there are no real legitimate rivals. And it's simply not how things are done there. The other part of it is he has become such an essential part of the culture, much in the way that Mao was, that it becomes more difficult for people to kind of create that separation when there's a cult of personality that's developed. So the people choosing to remove him is really not an option.
That's fair. And the other question that comes up is, well, what about journalists? And in this country, journalists' job is to hold the president responsible. I think we've seen this a little bit with the disappearance of tennis star Peng Shuai. How much leeway do journalists or anyone in China have when it comes to holding their party leaders responsible?
Not very much, not very much. And we've seen this. We've seen this in China. This certainly extends into Hong Kong, which we can talk more about in a little bit. But in Hong Kong, which has a little bit of a different situation tied to China, but constitutionally supposed to have more rights. Certainly, when it comes to the press, we're increasingly seeing a crackdown there as a result of Chinese influence. So, just to give you a quick example. And this is recently, this is within the past couple of months, that the Hong Kong Alliance in support of patriotic democratic movements in China was recently forced to scrub its entire web presence by the Hong Kong police as a result of the urgings of the Chinese government. And so that's the kind of influence that the CCP has over the press. And the example I just gave is not even in China itself. It's over, and again, very complicated in Hong Kong, and we can talk about that. But it just gives you a sense of if they can do that in a place where they do not have total jurisdiction, what is it that they're doing in a place where they do have that jurisdiction? I think, too, we saw a lot, if you watch the Olympics a few weeks back, that a lot of what China does is very much the generation of propaganda. And this is one of the things that the CCP has been very effective at for a long time, going all the way back to the way the Long March was mythologized in the 1930s, something that really was a military defeat for the Chinese Communist Party when they were fighting the nationalists. They were able to spin that and twist it into something that gave it tremendous momentum moving forward. And so even watching something like the Olympics, when we have the Olympian who is a Uyghur, who's the torchbearer, and the world watches and says, all right, well, see, the Uyghurs are just fine because, look, China has created this place of prominence for this Olympian. China's very, very good. Chinese Communist government is very good at controlling the narrative.
Yeah, and Lisa, we're going to go to the break. When we come back, I want to pick up right where we left off and talk about the Uyghurs and what may or may not be happening there. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Face the Issues is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. My guest again, Lisa Johnston, teaches at the Pingry School in New Jersey and at Northampton Community College in Pennsylvania. Lisa, welcome back. Thank you again for that breakdown of China, its history, and also kind of where it is today and how that government behaves today. Lisa, when we went to break, you had mentioned that in the Olympics, there was a Uyghur athlete from representing China who lit the torch, and this was part of a propaganda show, you had said. This is the biggest reason that the 2022 Winter Olympics have been controversial. It is China's alleged human rights offenses against the Uyghur people in the Xinjiang region of China. For starters, who are the Uyghurs that we're talking about?
So the Uyghurs are one of China's 56 ethnic groups. They are considered an ethnic minority. They are of Turkish and Indo-European background. The majority of Uyghurs, although not all of them, are Muslim. There are about 12 million Uyghurs. They live in a province known as Xinjiang province. It is in the northwest portion of China. And going back to what I mentioned earlier about geography being so important, I think that has really shaped the Uyghurs' relationship with China going back at least 1,000 years. Interestingly enough, the Uyghurs during the Song dynasty actually received tribute from China because the Uyghurs were the ones who were keeping foreigners out of China. So China actually respected the Uyghurs for their ability to keep China safe. Yeah. China officially brought in Xinjiang province during the Qing dynasty in the 1880s, named Xinjiang province the New Frontier, which is a name that is rejected by the Uyghur people. It is considered, at least nominally, a semi-autonomous region. There are Uyghur leaders, at least nominally, in Xinjiang province, but really, this is a very, very difficult situation. This is a group of people, again, ethnically disparate from much of China. They look to, for the most part, as I said, majority Muslim, to try to practice their own religion and have that kind of autonomy. That has not been something that's been embraced by the Chinese government. There have been crackdowns on religious worship. The Chinese government, I believe it was the early 2000s that much of these crackdowns started. The associations that the Chinese government claimed between the Uyghurs and Islamist groups coming out of Afghanistan. There is a very small portion of Xinjiang province which borders Afghanistan. And so the allegations that groups like Al-Qaeda and ultimately ISIS were coming in and perpetrating terrorist attacks was the rationale for China going into Xinjiang province and exerting more influence. And now it has just accelerated. And it has not just been an attempt to root out terrorism, but really to root out the entire way of life for Uyghurs who are not at all involved in terrorism, for families. And so there have been a lot of changes there. In the past couple of years, over 2 million Han Chinese have been moved into Xinjiang province for various reasons. In some instances, they actually live in the houses of the Uyghurs for surveillance purposes. Xinjiang province actually is surveilled very, very extensively. Large police presence and military presence, but there are actually people who are living at the behest of the Chinese government in the homes of the Uyghurs to make sure that they are not doing things like engaging in prayer, cooking meals that are not considered desirable. The biggest part of this is the re-education camps. That is the term that China had used, re-education camps, that many Uyghurs were sent to. China is now denying that those exist anymore. A lot of satellite evidence shows otherwise. At the very beginning of all of this, they sent pictures of what these re-education camps were supposed to be, people doing arts and crafts and painting and cooking, and it was supposed to be very pleasant. And the reality is these are, and a number of governments have used this term, that these really were far more like concentration camps. And are far more like concentration camps, that there is slave labor taking place, forced sterilization taking place, the forced separation of parents and children. Children who are being sent to places that are called kindergartens, but really are places where they can live independent of their parents so that they can essentially be indoctrinated and stripped of their heritage, their ancestry, and their religion.
Lisa, let me ask you this. The Congress has passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and in that process, in that act, they've said that in these labor camps, a lot of the Uyghurs are forced to work in textiles, electronics, food products, shoes, handcrafts, so forth. And both the current Biden administration and the past Trump administration have labeled this a genocide. They've brought that term out, and as you know from history, that is not a term that is always brought out. Does this, in your mind, qualify as a genocide?
I think according to the United Nations description of a genocide, I think it does. So the United Nations has, they have a number of components of genocide: killing members of a group, forcibly transferring children of people in that group against their will, forcible measures to try to prevent births within that group, deliberately inflicting bodily harm against members of that group, all in an attempt to either entirely eliminate or partially eliminate that ethnic group. And so I think according to the United Nations definition, I think it absolutely does fit that definition. But you're right, it has been somewhat controversial. I think if you look at the nations that have come out and said this is a genocide, nations like France, for instance, which were more comfortable doing it, and then you have New Zealand saying, we're going to stop short of saying this. I think there are a lot of places that are conflicted for many reasons. Ukraine, for instance, which has a lot of its own situation going on right now, had actually joined on to something that came out in the summer of 2021 through the United Nations, about 40 or so nations calling for surveillance in Xinjiang province so that there could be more transparency in what was in terms of what was happening there. Ukraine had signed on to that, and within days they withdrew their pledge. Because China threatened to stop providing COVID-19 vaccines. So there are all sorts of reasons why countries and various organizations are either calling it genocide or calling for additional surveillance or not. But I think certainly based on what how the United Nations defines genocide. I think it's absolutely fair to say it is.
You brought the situation with Ukraine, and this is a good segue into this question of a lot of people have wondered, when you look at the Holocaust, we essentially ended it because we got involved in World War II. And this was really Adolf Hitler invading neighboring countries, leads the world to war. The Holocaust ends as a result of the war ending. There's a lot of question about if he had not been invading other countries and this was just taking place in Germany, if that ever would have happened. And the same questions are being asked here in China, and especially with the globalization since World War II, the global markets, we know Apple and Disney, Coca-Cola, they all lobbied against this bill in Congress. And to your point, with Ukraine, where they are reliant on China and the market there for their COVID-19 testing, is there a sense in which the globalization that we've seen in the last half century makes it harder now to actually put the screws to China, if you will, on what's happening with the Uyghurs?
100%. I think that the current global economy makes all of this very, very challenging. There's just no incentive, save ethics and morality, for these countries to say we're going to stop doing business with China the way we're doing business with China. So there are just too many people who are lining their pockets as a result of this. And I think that there are certainly ethical dilemmas even for average Americans as consumers, as we try to ponder, what goods do we buy? Where do they come from? Is it even possible to get something that does not come from China if I want to try to take a stand in my own small way? And so it makes it incredibly challenging. And I do agree with you that had it not been for Hitler's territorial aggression and all of those other developments that then directly affected countries like the United States, that in all likelihood, the Holocaust would have persisted without intervention. And so I think one of the things that I think is especially disconcerting about this, there was certainly information about what Hitler was doing at the time. Although most of the information came to light, particularly to Americans, after Americans were in those camps and liberating them. But here we have information. We have really good information. We have some surveillance footage. We have Uyghur refugees who have made their way to Turkey. There are 50,000 Uyghurs in Turkey who are telling their stories. We have some pretty good information. And still, we're not doing too much about it. And I think the economic situation makes that incredibly complicated.
Lisa, last question: how should we respond? Should the West care about what's happening in China, and if so, how do we respond to it?
It's a great question. I think the West has to care about China because China cares about the West. So in 2021, China released its most recent 5-year plan. And in it, they specifically mentioned attempting to deal with the challenge of the United States in particular. They want to be dominant economically. They want to not only dominate the international economy, but they want to really call a lot of the shots in the international economy. And they have made it very clear that they want to overtake the United States as the world's sole superpower. And it's not just a matter of the United States simply stepping aside and saying, "Go ahead, China. You could fill in now. We've had enough of our turn." Life as we know it, I don't think would continue the same way. Even when we think about what does warfare mean in the 21st century, I think we're talking about hacking, and we're talking about potentially compromising the banking system and the electrical grid and the water supply. We already have issues with supply chain. What does that look like if we have international adversaries getting involved in that? And so I often think about something that came out of the 9/11 Commission report. Tom Kane, who was one of the leaders of the 9/11 Commission, wrote in this report that 9/11 happened because of a failure of imagination by Americans. And I often think, and it's not only Americans, it's all over the world, that we are so focused on what we're doing now and the way things have been done, that sometimes we just fail to consider all of the other possibilities of something that could happen. So I think when it comes to keeping an eye on China and watching what happens next, I think there will be a lot of things that probably surprise us. And I think that if I'm to humbly advise anything, it would be to not succumb to that failure of imagination again, to try to think very critically about some of these issues. and for people to have conversations about them.
That's fantastic advice. Lisa, thank you again so much for your expertise, for joining us, and for breaking this issue down. I sincerely appreciate your time and your expertise today.
Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you. And don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Again, my thanks to Lisa Johnston for joining us and for breaking down this issue. The reality is this: after World War II, we pledged never again to these human rights atrocities. And yet some 70 years later, we find ourselves right back to where we were then. The Chinese Communist Party has been committing systematic genocide against the Uyghur people in the Xinjiang province of China. These Uyghurs have been rounded up throughout China, but also shipped in from other countries, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and elsewhere. They're held in concentration camps, forced to work in labor camps, and subject to mental, physical, and psychological abuse. But what are we doing about it? Nothing. These labor camps produce some of the goods that we enjoy in the United States and throughout the world. And so when Congress passed a condemnation of these acts, corporations such as Apple, Coca-Cola, and Disney showed up to protest. The reality is, if we're going to stand up for justice, we need to stand up for the Uyghur people in China. And we can't allow our comfort with our iPhone or with Disney or with our favorite Coke product to get in the way. We either stand for justice all the time, or we don't stand for justice at all. And history will ultimately be the judge of how we respond in this moment. That is our show for tonight. Again, I want to thank Lisa for joining us, and I want to thank all of you for tuning in. Hope you'll be with us again right here next week. Until then, my name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.